Our next guest spent 2 decades working as a nurse, providing care and compassion to every patient crossing her path, all the way from the neonatal unit to the geriatric ward. She's now sharing those stories in a new book, walking readers down hospital hallways and behind closed doors. The Language of Kindness is a compilation of the patients and people who made an unforgettable impression on Christie Watson. And Christie joins us in studio this morning. Christie, thank you for being here.
Thanks for having me.
Before we start on the book, we are on door watch today. We are watching the Linda. It's exciting. And as someone who has worked inside British hospitals, I wonder what are your thoughts when you see the chaos outside of the hospital and couple that with the chaos that you know inside a hospital? It's got to be very difficult to be in that hospital today.
Well, I know the chaos very well because that was the hospital that I worked in for many years.
Really?
So it's super exciting for me. And I know that the staff will be really excited as well.
They've had experience doing this sort of thing.
They've had experience. This is the hospital that happened. You know, we've had royal babies born there before. Yeah. So I think it's a great honour. It's an NHS hospital. She's in the Linda wing, which is the private wing, but it's a fantastic hospital, St Mary's Hospital. So I'm very proud that she's giving birth there. And we are all on high alert.
All right, Christie, let's talk about the book because you take us all the way back to the beginning. You said when you were 16, you went to move in with a boyfriend. You said you had no direction. To say you had no direction was an understatement. So how do you go from being that person to someone who is attracted to a career that requires such discipline?
I fell into nursing, really. I don't think I was attracted to it. I think it was more of a needs must. And I watched some nurses that I'd been working with as a volunteer and how they were caring for patients, and they said, nursing is a great career, it provides you a bursary and gives you somewhere to live. So those were the things that appealed to me. But when I started, I loved it straight away. I just found my vocation, and after many ideas of different careers, I knew that that's what I wanted to dedicate my life to.
Despite, as you say, being queasy at the sight of blood.
I'm still queasy at the sight.
Are you? So how did you get through that?
If I see something on television or read something in a book that depicts a horrible scene, then I find it really hard. But if you have a patient in front of you and they have need of care, then my queasiness goes out the window and I'm able to put that to one side and deal with it.
Let's talk about one of those patients, Aaron, 19-year-old, the first time you ever watched a lung-heart transplant. Talk to me about this person.
So he was a little boy who had cystic fibrosis and he needed this big operation, and pre the operation he was pretty sick, actually. He was on the edge of life. And I remember standing in this operating theatre for hours and hours and hours and watching this, what I think is a miracle, of just him. His body was like a dugout canoe. It was empty of any organs. And then seeing the scrub nurse and the organ donation coordinator nurse, just the interaction between them, and watching the surgeon's hands dancing inside this child was just miraculous. And I'd never felt more wide awake my whole life, despite being standing there watching him. And then afterwards, seeing his recovery, and he recovered quite rapidly, and just seeing him turn from a child who was listless and coughing all the time and unable to get out of bed to a child who was able to live a full life was just a huge honour to be part of.
You know, you tell these stories with happy endings, but not every story has a happy ending. You interacted with people at the end of their lives, people who had very difficult lives, abuse, stories of death. How did you get through those hard days?
Most of the time, people get better, which is really consoling. But even when people don't get better, if you've managed to provide their family with some kind of dignity and some kind of comfort during the darkest hours that we will all go through at some stage, then I think that's the privilege of nursing.
We all go through tough times, but you as a nurse over 20 years must have had to deal with an onslaught of sort of days filled with pressure and negativity. And you describe something called compassion fatigue, being burnt out, being tired. Talk to me about that, because a lot of nurses watching, and a nurse anywhere around the world would probably understand this notion of compassion fatigue. Can you explain it to us?
I think the reason I wrote this book is because nursing is the most undervalued of all the professions, and it should be raised to a higher status, because nurses, as you say, swallow emotion and they swallow grief, and they do experience post-traumatic stress symptoms and get burnt out and tired. And even in those situations with compassion fatigue, they still manage to provide really good care. The vast majority of nurses do that. So I do think that despite suffering these emotions, the fact that nurses can still give so much of themselves on a daily basis is something to really honour.
You also end the book by describing your last day as a nurse. What was it like walking away from this career that you invested so much in after 20 years?
I'm still registered as a nurse. I haven't come off the register yet.
Oh, really?
So I don't work clinically on the wards anymore, but I feel like I've got a great platform to be able to talk about nursing and continue being an advocate for nurses now with writing and teaching and talking about it. So.
And the story is that there was a massive bidding war to transform this story into a television show, so even more people are going to learn about your story.
Yeah, and it's a huge privilege to be able to put some realistic drama about nursing onto the television screen and hopefully reach more people and tell them about the reality of the job of a nurse.
Christie, thank you so much for being here. Thank you for sharing your story.
Thank you so much for having me.